without any further ado, I give you Susan Carpenter. She is the Native Plant Garden Coordinator and Gardener at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum. And she's with us to talk about native bees.
Great. Thank you, Kara. It's great to be here tonight and great to talk about one of my favorite topics. Now that we have summer suddenly arriving, everyone is becoming a little more aware of the bees. I personally had a bumblebee following me around today for some reason, so bumblebee queen. So I'm really glad to be here and share a little bit of information about bees. As Kara mentioned, I am at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum, and I encourage you to come and visit the Arboretum and the Native Plant Garden there right at the Visitor Center anytime that you can. So I have a few numbers here. This is a little bit of a distressing slide, but just to emphasize the importance of pollinators and the importance of bees in particular. But let's just consider that 75% of the world's food crops, now these are just food crops, depend at least in part on pollination. So they have to have insects or other animals involved in that pollination step in order to produce those foods. And about 90% of wild flowering plants depend to some extent on animal pollination. So these are the plants that form the basis of the food web. They're the wild plants, the wild flowers, if you will, that are very, very important to all the animals, birds, and other life, including people, that depend on the basic plant level of the food webs. There are 20,000 species of wild bees worldwide. Bees are one of the most important groups of pollinators. And we also have butterflies, moths, wasps, beetles, birds, bats, and some other animals, if we look worldwide, that contribute to pollination. And 40% of the invertebrate pollinator species, so these are mostly bees and butterflies, are facing extinction. So those are some pretty disturbing numbers in some ways and some pretty important numbers to keep in mind as we move into the talk. I want tonight to give a pollinator overview, look at the different types of pollinators, and then talk a little bit about the life histories of bees in particular, because there are so many different kinds of bees and they're being so important. We need to kind of start to think about what are the differences between them and what are their different life histories, because they are quite different one from another. The stressors, or the things that are impacting bees and pollinators in particular, I want to cover those so we can be thinking about those in terms of some of the practices that we use and the activities that we do to support pollinators. So creating and managing pollinator habitat be one of the topics, and then monitoring bumblebees. This is something that can be done with photography, and it's very straightforward. And we have a wonderful project here in Wisconsin called Bumblebee Brigade. It's housed at the Wisconsin DNR, and anyone can join it. If you have a picture of a bumblebee on your phone or on your camera, even if you took it in the past, you could still submit that photo and contribute to the statewide knowledge that we're developing about bumblebees. So what kinds of pollinator groups will we see in Wisconsin? Well, we have butterflies and moths, and I just want to make a note that every picture that you're seeing in this slide presentation that isn't a bumblebee was taken while I was out monitoring bumblebees. So when you're out in the garden or out in a natural area, out in the prairie, you will definitely see a lot of insects. Native plants bring insects in, and you'll definitely see a lot of them. And you can just start learning them without even trying, really, by taking a picture, and then you can identify. So wisconsinbutterflies.org is one of the websites where you can identify butterflies. So here's a fritillary butterfly here on a coneflower, and then a monarch, of course, here on the swamp milkweed or the red milkweed there. And if you don't know what the butterfly is, you can submit your photos or you can check that website, and it's excellent for identifying the butterflies you see. You can also see on that website where other people have been seeing a butterfly that you might want to learn about. So you can see like when the butterflies are emerging, first of the season, or what areas of the state they're being seen. So we have moths as well, and this is the moth column over here. These are some day-flying moths, which we normally don't think of. We normally think of moths kind of being creatures of the night, but these are some day-flying moths. Here is this is a clear wing moth, and it has kind of a bumblebee type of coloration to it. It's a fairly large moth. The flower that it is visiting here is a prairie phlox, and prairie phlox has this long tubular flower. So this insect has a very long proboscis that can uncurl and slip down into this hole all the way down to where the nectar is at the base of that tube. So these are really fun to see out in the garden. They look like kind of hummingbirds, or about that size if you just catches your eye. And there's this coloration, and then there's one that has more of a red and green color to it. So look for those. This is an 8-spotted forester moth, another day-flying moth. And this one, I'm not really sure why it's called a forester, because I usually see it in the prairie. But it is a beautiful black and white moth with those 8 spots, and then these lovely orange features here on the front. And I'm not too familiar with what its life history is. But if you have pictures of moths and you want to know what they are, you can submit the photos to bugguide.net, and that will help you identify those. We have flies and beetles as pollinators. So here is a leaf-footed fly up here, kind of a large fly on a goldenrod. This is a fly that looks like a bumblebee. So sometimes there are mimicking insects, in this case a fly with its very large eyes, little spike antenna or almost no antenna, and then if you could see carefully, it has only 2 wings instead of 4. So bees have 4 wings and flies have only 2. So when I saw this insect, I thought it was a bumblebee at first. I was like, oh good, another bumblebee. But as I watched it, I was like, I got closer and I zoomed in on it with my camera, and I'm like, wait a minute, you're not even acting like a bumblebee. So it's on a plant called meadow rue, and it was not, as I got closer, I'm like, oh, you're a fly. That just looks like a bumblebee. But we can get these identified on bugguide.net as well. And here's another fly here. You can see that the large eyes and that little tiny little spike antenna and just 2 wings on the back. And it's kind of got some coloration, orange and black, kind of a warning coloration to it. This is a beetle here. That beetle can fly, but usually you just see them crawling around, kind of roaming around on the flowers. We have wasps, and wasps can be effective pollinators as well. They're interesting in that they don't collect pollen from the flowers. They're just really going around on the flowers collecting nectar, which is a source of carbohydrate, and so it's nutrition for themselves. And so here you see them on a rattlesnake master flower head, and this is just on a plant where you can see the petals have all been falling off here, but just a wasp visiting there. And then this one is a giant golden digger wasp. So it's about 2 inches long, and it was just hanging on a grass there, or hanging on to this tall big blue stem, and it's holding on to a giant katydid. So this green thing here is a katydid, many times the size of that wasp, and it was grasping onto the katydid and then after this picture was taken, it lifted the katydid and flew off across the prairie. So what is it doing with a giant katydid? That is the food for its larvae. So it's going to it's a digger wasp, it's going to dig a hole, put the katydid into the hole in the ground, and lay its egg on the katydid. And the katydid then serves as a food, kind of like a built-in food source for that young. And there's no parental care, it's just a solitary wasp. There's no colony or anything, it's just that katydid with the eggs that are eating the katydid. Birds. We have hummingbirds, of course, in Wisconsin. Usually one species is really the ruby-throated hummingbird is the main pollinator. This is the giant purple hyssop, which is a native plant, kind of semi-shaded areas, and it's growing here with the elm leaf goldenrod, another nice shade-loving or semi-shade-loving plant. And this plant doesn't look like a typical hummingbird plant, but the hummingbirds really enjoy it. So they will come to it even though it doesn't have any red color. That's the flower head right there. But bees are the most important pollinators. And the reason they're the most important pollinators is they are actually going from flower to flower, not only nectaring and taking nectar for their own use, but they're also collecting pollen. And they collect pollen because they take the pollen back either to a colony, in the case of, say, a bumblebee here, or a honeybee. They take the pollen back to the colony, and it becomes the food for their young. Or in the case of solitary bees, which I'll talk in a minute about, they take the pollen and they provision an egg with that pollen, so that the egg, when the egg hatches, it can eat the pollen, just like the katydid was the food for the wasp offspring. And then the pollen is that food, the protein that can really support the growth of the colony and the growth of the individuals. So just keep in mind that all those insects can be pollinators, and bees are the most important group. So the bees collect pollen and nectar to feed the adults and the young, and other pollinators are just kind of transferring pollen accidentally as they move from flower to flower. And here is a picture of the rusty patch bumblebee. So this is the endangered species that it has been found in our area, and I'm sure that there are sightings for your area, and there could be more. But what you're looking for there is these bands on the abdomen. This is the second band on the abdomen. It has a rusty patch toward the front of the bee and a little fringe of yellow hairs toward the back of the bee. And then this one's showing the pollen that she's gathered from the flowers that she's visited. And she's actually visited 3 different kinds of flowers in this trip. Given when this picture was taken, this one color here is probably from roses. The second color is probably from a lead plant. And the third color, this white one, is from the flower that she's on right here. That's a spirea. So bees generally would gather pollen from maybe one species at a time, but sometimes you'll see this. So when we think about bees and their pollination skill and their activities, we also have to think about bigger picture. It's not just the bee and the flower, but it can involve other organisms within the system. So we all know that monarchs depend on milkweed as a food for their larvae. They require milkweed. So this is a female monarch laying eggs on a milkweed leaf. This is a common milkweed, and we've been familiar with that story for some time. The milkweed has flowers, of course, which is how the milkweed reproduces. And the flowers of milkweed are very specialized. They have a lot of nectar. So we'll always see a lot of insects visiting a milkweed flower. In this case, it's the butterfly milkweed, the orange flowered one, which just does well in sort of dry areas, either medium to dry areas. So it's a nice plant for home gardens. It's fairly small, and it doesn't spread out by rhizomes everywhere. It just kind of stays in a clump that gets bigger and bigger. So it's a nice garden plant. Visited by many insects, as I said, and the monarchs will lay their eggs on the butterfly milkweed as well. But the flowers of the milkweed are so specialized, and the pollen is held so tightly in those flowers that it takes a particularly strong pollinator to pull those pollen packets out and then have them be delivered to the next flower. And there's really not all those different pollinators that can do that. Mainly, it's the larger insects like the bumblebees and the wasps that can actually most commonly pollinate milkweed. And here we can see on this bumblebee, there are some golden, like little oval golden packets hanging down from the mandible and hanging down from the legs here, kind of trailing off the bee. This tells me that this bumblebee had visited a milkweed, had pulled those little pollen packets out, and was now foraging around and hopefully coming back to another milkweed to have those little packets slide into a little slot on the flower and then eventually go to form the pod. We're familiar with the pod that holds the seeds. So these bees are visiting the flowers. They're also visiting and pulling away this pollen, visiting other species, and eventually pollinating milkweed. And that is an essential part of the monarch's existence, because we need milkweed for monarchs, and milkweed is reproduced by seed and in some cases by its own stems. Like common milkweed can spread into an area by underground stems. So the bumblebees and other large pollinators are largely responsible for milkweed survival, and hence for monarchs' survival. Monarchs also need many other plants besides milkweed. Milkweed only blooms for a certain part of the season, so they need lots of flowers. And this one in particular, meadow blazing star, it's a liatrous species. It is one of their very favorites. They love to nectar on it. They love to gather on it. And even if you're planting one while it's blooming, they'll stay on it while you do your planting and watering and everything. They'll just stay on that plant. They enjoy it so much. So I recommend that one. It can be in areas that have a little more moisture, or in medium soils. It'll also work. So now let's think about all the bees. And we're just looking at Wisconsin here. So all these little squares, there's 400 squares here, and they represent most, if not all, of the native bee species in Wisconsin. So we have a big group over here. About 85% of the species of Wisconsin are solitary bee species. So they don't have colonies, they don't have hives, they live one by one, and the females and males mate, and the females provision eggs one by one with pollen that she collects by herself. And then after the eggs are laid and provisioned, that's the end of their care. They have no care, really. They go through an entire year, and they emerge the next year to repeat that cycle. About 15%, so this area up in here, are social or semi-social bees. That means they have colonies, or sort of kind of like a colony. They're not just solitary. So those are the species up in this corner. And if we look way up in the corner here, we have the bumblebees. There are 20 kinds of bumblebees in Wisconsin. And some of those are, we have in southern Wisconsin up to 12 or 14 species. I think at the Arboretum we've now documented 13 species there. Lots of gardens and natural areas have roughly 10 to 12 species documented. And then if you include the northern part of the state and other parts, western part of the state, you'll have a few other species added. So the 20 altogether. Some of those have not been seen in many years, and we don't have any good information about them. Others are quite common. So we'll get into that a little bit more with the bumblebee monitoring. I want to point out with this slide that there's one thing by itself. There's one species here at this, I just represent it with one tiny square. This is a social, meaning it has hives or colonies, perennial species, and it's the European honeybee. And European honeybees are used very much for agricultural uses. You know, hives are shipped around the country. People might have a hobby hive and just have it on their property, and then the bees go out and forage in an orchard, or perhaps just just around the neighborhood or the community. But there's only one species of European honeybee. So all those honeybees that you hear about are one species, and it has so there's no diversity within that, other than some of them can appear differently, like they can have a different color patterns, but they're the same species. And then all of these are that's the whole diversity of what we have that are basically wild bees that do the same roles, but without being cared for and they all have annual life cycles instead of being from year to year like a honeybee hive would be. So these are some of the solitary bees. When we think of that big group of solitary bees, we have basically some ground nesting species and some cavity nesting species. So these are bees these are bees here that are provisioning underground. And you can see this colony, not colony, but this kind of chamber here with a little ball of pollen and egg provisioned there. And they're just provisioning around here in all those little chambers. The bees actually there's dirt up there on the top as they dig that out. And this is in special kinds of soils. So we have an area at the Arboretum with these cellophane bees that we see here. And this is the time of year right now when they are active. They come out for a few weeks. They forage on willow and other early blooming plants, and they provision underground like this. And then in about a week or two, you don't see any evidence of them at all until next spring when they come out for a few weeks. So they are only using certain plants. They're not using anything from later in the summer. And then there are specialist bees that come out later in the summer or even in the almost early fall that specialize on the plants that are growing at that time. So we have lots of variety here. You can see this green metallic. There's a green sweat bee here. These tiny little sweat bees, maybe you've had one on your arm when you've been gardening and wondered what it was doing. Maybe you've seen these little holes in the ground in sandy soil, which maybe look a little bit like an anthill, but if you look carefully, you see there's no ants, it's just bees, and so on. These are some examples of ground nesting bees. These are the ones that I was telling you about the Arboretum. They're on this very early blooming shrub collecting nectar and pollen here. And then this is what it looks like on the ground with the dirt that they dug out, and there's a female coming out of her little nest. This is one of the fall, or actually this one's present throughout the season a little bit more, but this is in the fall on the New England aster. And you can also, if you have pictures of these small bees, you can also submit those to bugguide.net and get the identifications. Here's a small sweat bee, a ground nesting sweat bee on different summer and spring flowers, on the rose, on the lopseed, which is this one up here, and on wild geranium. And it looks like something else has been nibbling on the wild geranium in that case too, perhaps another leafcutter bee. Here are the cavity nesting bees, and this is, they are using like hollow stems and holes in logs and like places where other insects have made holes like this, little cavities in rocks. And what they're doing is filling that little tube with pollen, and then the egg is laid and it's sealed off, and pollen, egg, sealed off, and so on. So she just fills up the tube from the back up to the front and puts a bigger plug on the front of it, and that will be incubating for a year, and then they'll come out. So here we have carpenter bees and these yellow-faced bees and the leafcutter bees, which are fascinating because they're actually lining their chambers here and putting a little like covering around each egg and pollen provision made out of cut leaves that they cut out, or petals sometimes. They'll use flower petals as well. So that's kind of they have special mandibles to cut those and bring them into the chambers. And here's some examples of those. There's that cavity nesting leafcutter bee. She has the pollen carried not on her legs, but on the underside of her abdomen. So that's what the yellow color is here. This one's collecting pollen on the leg there. And these are some other types of cavity nesters on the milkweed. Bumblebee queens. So bumblebees are a very important pollinator. They're large, they have furry bodies, they have colonies of several hundred bees each, and these are some of our these are some of the biggest bees you'll see around this time of year. So here's the black and gold bumblebee. This one's foraging on a gooseberry. So these shrubs right now in the woods are just about to bloom, and you can see they hang down and the bees approach them from underneath, and they use a buzz pollination to shake the pollen out onto their bodies, and then they groom the pollen onto their legs to carry it back to the colony. This is yellow bumblebee on a lupin flower, and this is a rusty patch bumblebee queen on an almond flower there, a Russian almond. So the bumblebee life cycle is important to note because you will find them in your garden at different times of year, and it's good to have an idea of what you're really seeing. So as I mentioned, right now, this time of year, since we've had such a delayed spring in our area, the bumblebee queens have been coming out, but now we're going to see more of them as all the species do emerge. And what they are these queens that have been spending the winter since last fall entirely alone and underground in a little chamber that she dug herself last fall. And when she emerges, she needs to start a new colony. So she comes out, she has to find food for herself and for her young. She makes little wax cups here with nectar in to store for her own food, and she makes wax brood cells. This is where she lays her eggs and where she provides the pollen for the young to eat. And she sits on it like a chicken to keep it warm. She can use her flight muscles to keep that warm if the weather isn't quite suitable yet. And this is the building part of the colony. So she's going to continue to do that until she has hatched out enough, maybe 30 little worker bees, they're all females, they'll go out and do the foraging. So as soon as a month or so has gone by, she will be able to stay in the colony and keep laying eggs, and the little workers will go out and forage and bring back the pollen for the rest of the young that she's still laying eggs for. So we do this part of the colony as it builds up in size, lasts until about July or so for the most part. And that's the building part of the life cycle. Then from here on is the reproductive part. So at this point, when the colony's reached its size of, say, a few hundred bees, the female starts laying eggs that will become males and to become the future queens for the following year. So here's the future queen. She's emerged from the nest, and here's a male mating. And then after she's mated and done a little bit of feeding, she goes to an appropriate spot and digs underground and goes into her dormant period. And that can be as early as like August. She's underground for 6 months, at least, maybe more. And all the other, except for those mated queens that are underground, all of the other bees from that year's colony die. So she's the only connection between last year and this year. So they're very important. The queens are just very important. It's a very crucial part of the life cycle, of course. So what are some of the things that affect pollinators and pollinator health? There are a number of factors, and a lot of these factors don't act alone. So they could by themselves be very important, but they can also interact with each other. So pollinator habitat and nutrition is basically the kinds of floral resources that are available within a good distance of the nest, because the nest is where all the foraging has to take place from. So we want to have a good concentration of foraging habitat near nesting areas. And the nutrition is important because of diversity of those plants, of the native plants, is very important for the bees to have food throughout the season, and also just a good diversity of food in general. Pesticides. We have quite a number of pesticides that are used in agriculture, in home gardening sometimes. We use insecticides sometimes for insecticides are sometimes used for plant production to protect plants from insects feeding on them. That can have a bad effect on animals that use the pollen and nectar that's in the plant tissue. Climate change and weather, these are some factors where we're seeing storms, we're seeing additional storms, larger storms closer together. We're seeing extremes in weather. So last week we had frost, and today it was not near 90 degrees. So those kinds of extremes we can see more of, and just the fluctuation. We can see warm days in like March, which kind of get things started, but then snows coming, later in April. Some of those things are part of natural variation, but not all of them are. So we are seeing changes there. And those, for bumblebees, are an issue because they are a cool weather animal. So as temperatures warm, say from if areas become more warm, like more southern areas, then then the bumblebees that are adapted to, say, a mid-latitude, it might get too warm for them there. And they won't necessarily be able to move somewhere else. And the same thing with mountains, where they might be at an elevation, but as warming happens, that elevation is warmer, so now their range is much more limited than it could be. Diseases, pests, and genetics, these are all things that can, of course, interact with other factors. But disease, when the bumblebees when North American bumblebees were taken to Europe to develop them for using to culture them for using in greenhouse culture, which is how you get tomatoes in the winter. They're using bumblebees within greenhouses to pollinate the tomato plants. Then when those bees were taken to Europe, where everybody was learning how to do how to cultivate them for greenhouse use, and then they were shipped back, and they brought diseases back from those areas. So genetics, an issue with that is just when really small populations are not as viable as larger populations with more genetic diversity. So these things can interact. A colony which has poor nutrition will be more subject to disease and pests. So where do all the pollinators live? They live in urban habitat, and here's the arboretum. This is the garden that I work on. So here's the garden right here. We have our horticultural collection here, which has some very, very great pollinator plants in it as well. We have the Curtis Prairie next to it here, which is the restored prairie that you may have heard of that the Arboretum is well known for. We have savanna areas, woodland areas, wetlands, and then about 14 neighborhoods surrounding the Arboretum. So we have bees flying. Bumblebees have no trouble flying from the neighborhood to the Arboretum and back again. They may be nesting at the Arboretum and visiting our neighbors' plantings, or they may be nesting in the neighborhood and coming over to the Arboretum. So things are all connected. And we can think of our own communities, and I'm really encouraged to hear that Oregon is doing a lot of that connecting and expanding habitat. Also, our rural habitat is important, obviously. These are some areas here. This is in the driftless area. We've got working land, agricultural land here, but you can also see there's quite a bit of topography. We've got north-facing slopes, south-facing slopes, prairie areas, wetland areas, stream habitat, pasture areas, and forested areas that have a lot of the spring flora in them. And so this whole landscape that we're in southern Wisconsin has a lot of important elements that are important to supporting pollinators. And we want to think about all the areas, and as much as we can connect them, as much as we can enrich them, enhance them with more native species. So, pretty simple formula. Pollinator habitat equals native plants. Native plants equals pollinator habitat. And it's not, of course, there are other plants besides native plants that pollinators will use, but if you want to if you want to be sure and you want to have a good density, then you could go with native plants, and you're bound to have the kind of diversity that you're seeing here in a midsummer picture. This is like the beginning of July, where you can see lots of different plants. You can see the liatris blooming, the mountain mint blooming. Here's some sweet black-eyed Susan. You could see some Culver's root, this tall white spikes here of flowers, a big patch of Monarda back here. A lot of diversity just in this one bloom time. And if you came back the next week, you'd see some other species that had started to bloom, and some of these maybe had finished blooming. So there's always this changing. If you have a good diverse native planting, you'll have always changing blooms available throughout the season. You want to maximize the number and diversity of native plants in the landscape. So here we have a spring, the spring look. This is pretty much what it would look like right now in the woods. So here we have the phlox, not quite in bloom yet, but the bluebells are in bloom, and this is spring beauty in bloom here. All those little spring flowers. And then you want to have this seasonal succession of flowering, varied flower forms for all the different kinds of pollinators, and then even thinking about having grasses and other these bunch grasses here that can provide a place for those nesting areas and the overwintering spots. Usually they are digging those in loose soil under trees or in leaf litter, so not just out where the prairie flowers are. I also recommend that people plant the straight species, trying to avoid the cultivars or the nativars, as they're sometimes called. And the reason for that, it isn't just a blanket recommendation, but because I do encourage you to think about, to evaluate pollinator use of cultivars. So here is an example of, this is a cultivar of Baptisia or indigo, and this is the native one here. And this is out at the West Madison Agricultural Station. They have a demonstration garden, so you can go there when all the Baptisias are blooming, all the different colors and all the different types, and you can just watch the bees and see who's visiting them. This doesn't tell you whether they're using it, whether it has better nutrition or not necessarily, but at least it's showing you that she's collecting pollen on this one, she's collecting pollen on this one. If you see this orange coloring on their leg, that is the pollen that they've collected. So there is some research going on in different places about comparing the cultivars with the native species, and in some cases they find that the cultivar has a good pollinator value, but not always. A lot of times the cultivar is shorter, it's modified, the flowers are maybe double instead of just a single petal arrangement or head arrangement, and that makes it harder for the pollinators to use it, or they can't get anything out of it. So you can, straight species just means the native wild type. There are a lot of guides and plant lists and resources available. This was a guide that we put together for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee. They are revising their website right now. This is on Fish and Wildlife Service website. So it's just a screenshot of it. If they do not, in their revision, if they do not put this back up, you could get in touch with me and I can provide that information for you. It goes through early, mid, and late. It talks about the shade and the habitat type for each of the plants, and these are kind of the top recommended plants that we had determined for Rusty Patch Bumblebee. And if it's good for Rusty Patch Bumblebee, there are a number of bumblebee species that it's also good for, because Rusty Patch is not very unusual compared to some of the other species for the plants that it uses. There are also plant lists available on Xerces Society or at Pollinator Partnership, where you can put in your zip code if you say you're concerned with maybe up north or something, you have some property that you're planting at. You can put your zip code in and it give you a personalized plant list for that area. We want to avoid pesticides, especially the systemic insecticides. Now, I mentioned these before, that sometimes plants, when they're produced and grown, little plants when they're grown and then sold, have already been treated with insecticide. And it's the systemic insecticides are within the tissue of the plant. So it doesn't go away. It stays in the tissue, it goes into the flowers, the pollen and nectar, and it can affect the insects that are visiting those flowers or collecting that pollen. These are from a native plant nursery, so this is a rain garden mix. They are proudly not using any of those chemicals, but if you buy plants from other sources, you might want to double check to see if the plants have been treated with any kind of insecticide ahead of time. For your garden, it's nice to have logs, rocks, some leaf litter, and maintain some buffer areas. This is a perfect kind of situation here for a bumblebee nest to be created within those chambers. They're very opportunistic about their nesting. They will look for a lot of opportunities. They may be in compost, they might be in a hollow log, they might be in a rock wall or a rock pile like this or a log pile. They're a chipmunk hole, they're just, if you have a crack in the foundation, they might go in there. I'm just trying to think of all the examples of places I've found bumblebee nests. It's important when you think of all these bees, including those ground nesting ones we talked about before, to avoid using landscape fabric or rocks for mulch, like a thick layer of that and an impervious layer of fabric, because there's no way for them to get through that. And it basically just seals off large areas of the, of the ground that they can't use. What I recommend, instead of using a lot of mulch, is to plant your plants even more densely, like collect seeds from them, plant even more densely than you might otherwise. And then the plants themselves, root systems will definitely hold the soil. They will also bully out some of the weeds, so those don't have a chance to get started. And I know on top of, you can even have landscape fabric, and eventually the weeds will get started on top of it. So you can avoid that with the dense plantings. We leave the plant material standing over the winter and trim it out in the spring. This right here, right now, if you were to visit the Arboretum, this is our rain garden here, our big one. And that actually, what we were able to use prescribed fire there. Our crew came out, professional crew came out, and they burned that about a month ago. And it's already got plants, green plants coming up this far. It hasn't been too rainy, so it hasn't had a lot of standing water in it. The water's infiltrating now already, and it's just a fresh start. In the winter, it's kind of nice. This is the garden in the winter. It's kind of nice for me to have these beds with plant material still on them, because you can see people are walking around a lot, and they will make a path, but not through an area where they can see there were plants there. So for me, it's just kind of a convenience in a way to have, once there's a big snow cover, to have that information kind of readily observed on the ground. It's good to have, if you're doing this kind of gardening and you find people are like, well, why are you letting your yard get so wild, or why are you making such a wild flower bed? It's good to have some small signs or interpretive signs that you can put up. This is one, happens to be one from the Xerces Society, Pollinator Habitat, but there are others. Wild Ones has some. You can make your own, just to explain what your garden is, and people are interested in. If you had maybe the names of some of the plants that they're seeing, that's also very interesting to people. They want to know what those pretty plants are, especially the ones as they're blooming. So it could be quite helpful for communicating with people, even if you're not just talking with them while you're gardening. And then it's important to share what you know and what you've learned, and your pictures and all the things that you've come away with. Share it with the community. This is in our garden. Some of the youth groups are there, day camp and other groups, school groups are there, and we have activities and just hands-on learning for them in the garden. And then this is an adult group here, which is doing seed harvesting at an appropriate time, collecting, it looks like they're collecting some liatris seeds here, and perhaps this is some Joe Pye weed here. So they're collecting those seeds, and then if you have those from home, you can share them with people. or you can just reuse them in your own garden. But it's a fun activity to do, and it's fun to invite other people to help with it so that you can get more seed and you can then have more to share. So here's how I got started with bumblebees, because it was total accident. We had a visitor visiting our garden in 2010, and he took this picture of a bumblebee, and he asked us, he told us the story of that bumblebee. He said, it's very rare. You can see this is the rusty patched bumblebee with that tan or reddish segment and yellow to the back of the bee. He was surprised to see it. It had been lost over most of its range. The population had declined over its whole range. It hadn't been found in some areas in years. And had we seen any more of them besides this one that he saw? And we had no idea. We had not been really looking at our bumblebees carefully. I was like, how many kinds of bumblebees are there? We had no idea. So we began to right away ask questions like this one, very simple questions like which bumblebee species are present at the Arboretum and then out further away from the Arboretum and other southern Wisconsin sites. Which plant species are visited by each of the bumblebee species? We have, as I said, now we have 13 species at the Arboretum. Are they all the same? Do they all visit all the flowers, or do they have specialization within the group? Turns out they have some of that. And then, of course, how can we promote pollinator conservation and education? Those are important questions in the world of outreach. So how do we monitor them? With bumblebees, you can use a camera. You don't need to catch them. You don't need to touch them. In fact, at this point, we encourage people not to catch them, net them, or try to photograph them in little vials or anything. If you have rusty patch in your area, you're not supposed to handle it unless you have a scientific permit. So what we do is take pictures, and we take a picture that shows the back of the bee very clearly, something like this maybe, the wings are out of the way. And I just took these pictures of this bee foraging on this vervain, and I just took a whole bunch of them, and then I picked these out. So here's the back view, here's a side view, and then here's a face view. It shows the shape of her face and just some of the features on the face, which can help us, like this part right here, little section right behind the head that shows us some of the features that we need to identify. So with those pictures, I can easily identify that bee by comparing to resources that we have. And this one here happens to be a Bombus citrinus, or lemon yellow cuckoo bee. And the cuckoo bee is a nest parasite of other bumblebees. So when this bee is present, you know that you have healthy populations of either one or two of the other species that it goes into their nest, and it lays its own eggs in the nest so that that other species, the host species, takes care of, raises the young of this one. And she can just move around and either lay eggs in different nests, or she can go into a nest and kill the queen and then just take over the egg laying, and then the workers of the host species continue on. So it's a little bit like the cowbird situation with birds, but it's a nest parasite. So it can be interesting to see these parasite species because it does tell you something about the presence of the host species. I always tell people to remember to take a spacer photo. If you're taking pictures, like 10 pictures of one bee, then take a spacer photo like the ground or something else, and then start your next bee so you don't get mixed up on who's who. Of bumblebees of North America is very helpful. These ID sheets from Illinois and Missouri are very helpful. Bumblebee Watch, if you're traveling around the country, Bumblebee Watch is a nationwide project, so you can document bees in different areas. These are some of the identification sheets, so that's from Bumblebee Brigade. You'll see all the variations here of the different species, but within each species you can have even more variation. So you'll never get bored identifying bumblebees. You always have something to learn. And then these are some other diagrams with photos that help you recognize them more readily. And as you learn species, then you'll be able to recognize something that you haven't seen yet, and so that's how you build out your knowledge. This is where people are finding rusty patch bumblebees. And so here you have the Madison area here in Oregon down there. Milwaukee, down in Illinois, there's been a lot of findings lately. Twin Cities has an active program. So but we do see, these are all observations for the most part by individuals with cameras. And our project in Wisconsin has really grown, and that has contributed a great deal to this. This map is from the Fish and Wildlife website, where they gather all the rusty patch information from any source and bring it together. So each of those dots, the red dot is the area or zone where the bee was found, and the yellow expanding out from it just shows suitable habitat in that area. So it may be that there are more colonies present. It's just and you can see where lots of people are watching in cities and towns and along that forest preserve there in Illinois. So that's it's a little bit deceptive, because are there any bumblebees in through here? Are they here? Rusty patch, are they in here? Probably, maybe. So if you're traveling in those areas, take your camera along. We also collect information about nests. So a bumblebee nest isn't very obvious sometimes. This is a queen coming out of a nest that's in the ground, and they will actually take the leaves and grasses and cover the nest opening. Again, if you open it out so you can see it better, they'll come back and cover it back up again. So you can submit records for the nests on Bumblebee Brigade as well. And these are two of our bumblebee pollinated plants that are starting to blooming now in some areas. So they're prairie smoke and shooting star, where they have that little pendulous flower hanging down. The bumblebees come up underneath, buzz pollinate, the pollen comes down, and they gather it on their leg. So these are two of my favorite prairie flowers that are just starting to bloom now. This reference up here, this link, if you want to take a picture of that or check it on the screen later, that is a handout that you are welcome to access. And if you have trouble accessing it, just let me know and I will see that you get it. We have lots of people to thank for all the work that has gone on in the garden and also in the Bumblebee project, and our funders are here. So I will take questions if there are any anywhere in the audience. Thank you so much.
Any questions come in on the YouTube stream?
Okay.
But I have some.
Sure.
So you mentioned the systemic pesticide, and then it goes into the leaves. Will it stay in the leaf forever, or once it sheds the leaf and then grows a new one?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it depends on. I think it wouldn't last forever, because the plants are dying back to the ground again. Mm-hmm. So whatever was in the leaf tissue that wasn't, I don't know if it translocates back into the storage of the plant for the winter, and then that's what grows back up. I've read, and I don't know for sure, but I've read that it can last over 1 year, more than 1 year. But that is a great question that I would need to dig into a little more into the literature for it. Yeah.
So if you have a plant that's got
insecticide in it,
will, if a bee or another pollinator takes nectar from there, will they die from it?
Actually, what seems like the main effect is for the bumblebees is that they take it back to the colony, and the colony, instead of producing many multiple queens, would only produce a few. So it has a more of an effect, not so much at the in that case, in the individual health level as the reproduction and that life cycle, which is just crucial for, if you think of a healthy colony producing 20 or more queens, that, can then be the hope for next year. But if it's reduced by being exposed, and this is an experimental study, so they exposed the colony and found that they could only produce like 2 future queens. And that's really a low chance that, survivorship may not be that great if you just have 2 queens.
Would all queens or all bees die after a life cycle?
Well, the annual ones, yes. I mean, the queens are of bumblebees. They're hatched out in, say, maybe July or August. So then they mate, and then they go underground, and then they're alive the next season. They emerge, and they're alive the next season until the end of the season. So they have the longest life cycle. The workers are out for maybe a month, 6 weeks, something like that, and then there's new workers along the way. And the males are the ones that are coming out in like August and July and August, and then they don't go back in the colony. So you see them out on the flowers, like all the way into the fall. They're like sleeping on the flowers until the very bitter end. But then they die,
So they're just nourishing themselves.
Yeah, they're nectaring and mating, all important things. Yeah.
Well, I had a question on ground bees. I've mowed the same lawn for 40 years, and 2 years ago, I got into a nest of ground bees.
Okay.
They're very nasty.
Yes, now those are,
I got bit maybe a dozen.
yes. Did they chase you?
I'm still leery of that spot
Right.
on the lawn, but they don't seem to
Yeah.
be there. They come and go.
They have a 1-year cycle as well. Now they're technically not bees. They're technically wasps, although we always do call them ground bees, right? So that's a big colony. And by the end of the summer, it's huge. When you've seen those colonies that are like paper, like the paper ones with the hornets, and it's like that, only it's underground. It's not a round ball, but it's like layers of those same kind of combs underground. And yes, they can be very,
Yeah, I couldn't get them off.
yeah, they'll chase you. And so if you can run, and maybe if there's a tree or something or side of a building, if you can just make a quick turn, and they might keep going, and you.
I did get away with it.
Yeah, no, yeah, they might come to the same area because it's a suitable
Yeah.
type of area, but
High and dry during air conditioning.
yep,
And they just were all over on that hill.
yep,
But then I hadn't seen it for a couple of years. So.
fingers
So
crossed.
I've been quiet.
Yeah,
I haven't mowed there yet, so I'll let you know.
all right, that'd be good to know,
We
yeah.
also found them we used to mulch our maple leaves in the woods and then bring it out as leaf mold
Yep.
in the spring for the garden.
Yeah.
And one year we started forking into that pile of leaf mold, and out came the bees.
Were they,
That's the end of that pile of leaf mold.
were
We
they,
used that
they
again.
were the same, those same,
No, probably 50 yards.
Well, they were quite a ways away.
but the same
Well,
kind?
We have,
Probably the same kind.
we have an acre plus of land.
Yeah,
And the ones he's talking about are to the front near the close
Yeah.
to the road, and these are way back in the wood on the tree row.
yeah, they'll find,
It's the same idea.
they'll find all the spots,
Yeah.
yep, to just, I mean, everything wants to live.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I have another question
Yes.
about wasps. So we get wasps, around, and I spray to kill them because I don't want to get stung a bunch. But I know they are pollinators too. So and then I also don't want to kill other pollinators with my wasp spray or something.
Right.
So how can we kill the wasps that will hurt us and not feel bad about it because we're killing pollinators?
Yeah, well, the wasps, I mean, if you have a situation where the wasp nest is in an area where you're definitely going to be, going back and forth, like by the stairway or whatever, then that's the case where, you're probably more likely to treat it. And okay, but if they're the same, if they're the wasps, the yellow jackets, the ones that are really, that have those huge colonies late in the season. Well, one thing is if it's very late in the season, is they're just about to stop. They do, but if you see one where they're just coming and going, coming and going, coming and going, and you're going to be encountering it, then that's probably one where you're just going to say, okay, well, yellow jackets, wrong spot for this. Or, maybe a pet, where a pet has to, be a lot. My dog likes to eat insects out of the air, so I'm discouraging him from stinging insects that we've seen.
It's a spicy.
Yeah. So I think you're the wasps, like the big wasp that I showed you there, the solitary wasp. They look scary, but they are solitary and they have nothing. The reason that the yellow jackets are so aggressive is because they are protecting this huge colony that they have, and some of them actually that's their individual job to be protecting. Okay. And whereas a solitary wasp isn't going to have that mentality at all. And you saw how many bees. I don't know the breakdown for wasps. I know where I can look for that because Heather Holm has a beautiful big book about wasps now. But I don't know the breakdown of solitary versus social that would help inform your question. But that's what I would look for, because if your reaction is like all wasps are going to chase me around the prairie or around the yard, then you're going to be giving credit to some wasps that aren't going to have anything to do with you at all. They're
most of those yellow jackets, right?
Yeah, I think the yellow jackets is kind of a special case. Plus, there is a native yellow jacket species, and I don't know, maybe there's more than one. They're still somewhat aggressive, but not as aggressive as the non-native ones that are more aggressive. So, I think you kind of have to play that by ear, and you're not. If one colony, one colony of yellow jackets, you're not appreciably declining your pollinator population around there.
We had them build, was it yellow jackets that was hornets?
They were very tiny. Bee or
We had a
wasp.
step outside our patio door, one step down to the deck or the whatever, and they were in there.
Going underneath there.
In and out. So every time you open that door, couldn't open that door anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, you've either got to go around or
Quite a bee.
yeah.
Use the other door.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there's a spot that's a favorite spot, but it's not the same. It's a new colony. So.
We found in an old deck where we had a railing, and they built
Up underneath.
the little nests up underneath. So
Yeah,
when we
but
did
those were the
deck,
smaller, like
with
just
holes
smaller
in it, right.
clusters.
And the next time we redid our deck, no railings, none. It's on the ground, it's low, you fall off, you're out of luck. No way we're putting it in. We had a little one at the time. She got
Yeah.
stung, and that was the end of that.
Yeah, and I mean, people who have, that's another concern. Of course, if someone has bee sting allergies, this is not the project for them. I mean, that's just straight up, but
No real want to be done with it.
yeah,
Hummingbirds.
yeah. I mean, I've been stung, I can count on one hand the number of times I've been stung by bumblebees, and I'm around them all the time.
And the big fluffy the actual bumblebees, do they sting?
They can, but very rarely. Usually it's around, in my experience, it's been around the time that they're producing the new queens, the colony's producing the new queens. I think they do a little more protection or they get more irritable or something around that time, because that's the most common time of year, around early August, where we'll end up having someone get stung, and maybe in the areas where they're also digging and overwintering. I don't know for sure. I mean, I know it's happened in an area like that where we did find overwintering queens just accidentally while we were gardening. So I'm just kind of speculating on that now.
They seem to be on a mission most of the time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They're busy.
Yeah.
They don't like-
They'll let you know if you're too close. Like if one comes flying across, like in front of you, like back and forth in front of you, that means step back.
Can I step back?
And when they're on the flower and they stick their middle leg up toward you, that's another thing, warning for stepping back. Yeah.
Halt. Yeah.
Go.
Halt. Exactly.
Are we still recording?
No, we are not.
Okay. Yeah, so do we have any other questions?
So I started to see bumblebees on my, and I can never remember the name of this plant, but it's got purple flowers, it's blooming now. It has polka dotted leaves. You get
Oh, the
leaves.
lungwort? Is it
Yeah,
lungwort?
plumeria.
Yep.
Plumeria,
Pul-
that is, I
pulmonary,
can
yeah.
never remember the name of that.
Yeah.
Plumeria, yes, and I have one good-sized plant. And
They would
I see
love that
bumblebees
one.
on there
Yeah.
already.
Yeah, so those are the queens, and if you can get pictures of them, you'll see which species you have. I mean, the earliest ones to come out are usually common eastern and the two-spotted, and then, but we've already had reports of rusty patch out. I think it was one of the bumblebee monitors in Madison who found it in her yard, and it was April 24th, and I think that's the first record for a rusty patch queen anywhere in the range. So right here in Madison.
I'll
So
have to get my camera out.
yeah,
Take pictures with my phone and get the camera out again. I haven't
yeah,
used it.
and there's a lot of resources on Bumblebee Brigade showing, like pictures of all the different species. And when you put your pictures in, when you submit them, then we are on the back end. Our experts are verifying your identification, so you can just do your best to identify it with the resources there, and then it'll be corrected if it's wrong, or it'll be, green check mark if it's good, if it's correct. Yeah, and you can. It's really fascinating. I mean, I didn't know anything about bumblebees before we started. Before we learned about it there, and it's just been so great to, see how excited people are to.
What's the other one besides Bumblebee Brigade, the bug?
A Bumblebee Watch for if you're
Oh, that
going.
too, but there was a bug guide.
Oh, Bug Guide. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I use Bug Guide a lot for those because there are, you can use iNaturalist or anything else, but Bug Guide is like the experts of all the different groups. They're in there, so you can send a picture. I was at a BioBlitz one time, which is like a 24-hour thing where you document every living thing in an area. So there's like plant people and fungi people and all the insect people and everything. So we were all there. It was like, 100-some people. And it started at 3:30 in the afternoon, and then it goes till 3:30 in the afternoon the next day. So like the moth people are there all night, and it's like wild. And so I had taken pictures of one of those bumblebee mimics, not the one I showed here, but a different one. And I didn't know what it was. And I was like, well, I could just say, I could just describe it and tell them what it was. I'll send it to Bug Guide overnight. 3 a.m, somebody got in there and sent me an email, came in, telling me what species it was and everything. So 1,000, it was we had, I think we had 1,102 species or something like that documented in that 24 hours. So that bumblebee mimic got in there too with this correct name.
Yeah, there you go.
So yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, very nice. Now, the wildflower seeds that are available here, we have an old asparagus bed, we're gonna burn it off and put in the wildflower seeds.
Uh-huh.
And just spread them on the ground?
Yeah, there's instructions
there are.
with them, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I have there, I'll have to print some more.
Oh,
That
okay.
should bring
I'll
it-
print
You
some.
can pop over to the library.
Perfect.
Pick up
Yeah,
some.
oh, they have
Oh,
them in
yeah.
the library.
Okay.
Yeah, the
Yeah, you can get
instructions
seeds
are-
in.
Yeah, and if you have bare soil, yeah, I mean, if the main thing is getting seeds in contact
Yeah.
with the soil for sure, and you don't have to fuss. Yeah, you can moisture to germinate them, but native plants like the native plants in our garden, after we plant them, water them in, and these would be small plants like this that we started with. Water them in. We use a little bit of light leaf mulch around them just to keep the soil moisture a little bit even. Unless it's a terrible drought, we just water it in, walk away. I mean, we don't. And they're very resilient to periods of drought throughout the season. We have a few weeks where it doesn't rain. The grass starts to get, the lawn starts to get kind of crispy and brown, and the native plants are just going along, not a problem.
So if it's seed, we just mix it with some sand and spread it around.
Yeah, so you can
Put
see,
a little bit of leaf mulch over it,
Yep.
and that's not much.
yeah, just water it,
And you don't have to dig holes or do anything.
No, you know, it should be really close to the surface for most of them.
Well, so many of them reseed themselves anyway. They
Right.
drop on the ground, next year you got 10.
Right,
Back to
right.
2.
Where there's openings, yep. And after a while, it kind of fills in, and then you get your new ones like on the edges, because that's where
Right.
there's a little bit of opening.
And the seed packets that we have, I think there's like 25 different varieties of wildflowers, and about half of them are native in Wisconsin. So, because it's the Midwest native varieties. So
Yeah.
they're-
Pretty much full sun ends up on the hill.
Mhm.
Yeah, usually it'll say
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
packet for what conditions.
We have a volunteer butterfly weed.
Oh, nice.
Nice.
I didn't know it was a milkweed variety, but I guess it is. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just looked up there one day and thought, what is that orange thing in the middle of the asparagus?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like this. And it had butterflies on it for,
Oh, yeah.
it bloomed for a month.
Yeah, yeah.
And we had butterflies all
Oh,
over
that's
it. So
great.
I bought a couple more plants for a different garden, but now I'm just gonna.
Get the seed from those, and yeah. Well, if you've, especially that one, if it can be a little bit finicky about where it'll grow, but if you've got it growing well somewhere, then just keep expanding it keep expanding into that area.
Bird pooped it in the winter.
Yeah, it probably flew in because they have the, you know, when the pods open up, they have that fluffy stuff that comes, well, the fluffy stuff is attached to each seed, so it could come from quite a ways, actually.
And we're
Yeah, that's
talking
great.
about the low
Yep,
orange.
yep,
That's-
yeah, that's great.
That's what it is.
Oh,
I
great.
didn't know it was a milkweed.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Take a real close look at the flowers of it next when it's blooming, because you'll see the little cups on the top. They have a lot of nectar in them. You're just looking at the nectar going like, wow. And then the little pollen packets are in between. So there's a little black, like a little black connector and two little packets that come down. So if you can get a pin or something and try to push up on that little black connector, it's kind of between those cups on the top of each flower. Each flower has like 5 of those, so in between them. And then that, if you can press that up with like a pin or something, you might see those 2 little, like they look like little saddlebags almost, like coming out. Those are the pollinia. And then they have to slide into that little slot on the flower. So it's kind of a miracle that plant can actually reproduce, you know, but each plant gets, you know, a few pods, and each pod has thousands of seeds, and so it works. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, we have
Swampweed,
yeah.
that I collected seeds from, and it's just so much.
That's gorgeous. Yeah.
It's
For more of a wetland area, or in a wet year, it can grow pretty much anywhere. But on a drier year, then it likes a little more moisture, like maybe near downspout or drain, you know, lower.
That's my clay soil. 'Cause it stays wet.
That's good. It stays
Yeah.
wet. Yep.
We have a lot of clay around here.
Oh yeah, lots of clay.
So
Right.
many seeds.
The
It's
fact
amazing.
sticks in my head, if you take either a square inch or a square foot of ground, there's thousands, literally thousands of seeds in that general area, if you're up maybe in a wild spot.
Well, there could be. I mean, there could be when we look at the like a prairie. If you're doing a prairie restoration, we're actually, when we scatter seed for that, we're actually scattering, like the rate would, a kind of low rate would be maybe 50 or 60 seeds per square foot, but you know, there can be seeds in the soil, there could be seeds dormant, and of course a lot of those seeds over the winter, like I leave the material up, a lot of those seeds are getting eaten throughout the winter. So they're not necessarily going to be growing, but birds are eating them all winter long, and the little animals underneath the snow are eating them, and then they're also eating the crowns of the grasses and things of the garden. And you think, well, that's a problem, but once spring comes, you can just rake off, and they've eaten, like the crown of the grass is like a little mound. They've eaten everything from last year, they've eaten it off, so you just rake it off. But then the feeding itself stimulates the new growth. So they're keeping you, like, you know, keeping it going. Because these are prairie grasses that have a long root system, and they're not going to be, you know, damaged by some vole coming
My
by.
neighbor turned 7 acres of cornfield into prairie.
Wow, good job.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's neat.
Got a lot going on there.
Yeah, well, when you start putting the native plants in, all of a sudden it's like all the birds, the spiders, and yeah, all the animals. It's and the food chains, and yeah, it's really amazing. I'm having a little trouble with woodchucks right now, though. They're kind of
We have a resident. Would you like him?
well.
He was sunning himself on the mower ramp that goes into our shed. The other day, he was standing up on 2 feet. Yeah, just sunning,
Checking out
standing
things
in
on
the
the
sun.
back,
Yeah.
back porch.
During
He is underneath. The building
yeah.
is underneath.
during the pandemic, the first year was I had no volunteers working with me or students. Normally, I have about 50 volunteers and a couple students working with me in the summer, but I had to do the gardening by myself because we were shut down. And that year, there were so many woodchucks just frolicking around because I mean I couldn't be everywhere, but normally there's kids there and all the day camp kids, and it's just a wild activity center, and it was so quiet. They were like having baby woodchucks, and the baby woodchucks were playing on the lawn, and I was like, oh boy.
People, you had woodchucks.
So
Yeah.
just to start, have you worked at the Arboretum?
I work at the Arboretum, yeah. I'm the native plant gardener there. I've been there almost since the beginning of the garden. I started there in 2003, and so the garden started in, 2002. So, yeah, it's been an interesting project. I work with, the designer is Daryl Morrison, who's a landscape architect, and he designed the garden more than 20 years ago, and he's actually been involved along the way ever since the beginning. So, and he just published a book last year that has a lot of, it's a part memoir and part about design, garden design and native landscaping and everything. But it turns out all the projects that he's done in all the places, New York City and Montana and Texas and Utah and all the different places where he's done projects, his favorite one is the native plant garden at the Arboretum. So it's really been, I don't know how many gardeners get to say that they work with a designer who designed the garden, after 20 years. It just doesn't seem like a thing, but it's been really great to work with him all this time.
Very cool.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming.
Oh, yeah.
Much appreciated.